There were many suffragette and suffragist groups in Norfolk, in all the major towns, and others in the smaller market towns and even the villages. The group in Great Yarmouth is especially interesting because it is the only one for which the minute book survives. So it is the one time we can get into the actual detail of who the suffragists were in a particular town and what they actually did. Women who wanted to campaign for a vote might join one or more of a large number of societies, some based on their church, for example, on their job, or on their political affiliation. But there were three main strands of suffragist and suffragette activity, which really became mutually exclusive, and the tensions between these large groups are reflected throughout the minutes of the Yarmouth Suffrage Society. The first of these large groups in the field was the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, led by Millicent Fawcett, and this group was dedicated and committed to peaceful activity. So we're thinking petitions to Parliament, we're thinking demonstrations, marches, distribution of literature, talks to educate other women, but no violent activity. And this was the largest group by far of these major suffragist and suffragette groupings. But the most well-known of the groups is probably the Women's Social and Political Union. This split away from the NUWSS in 1906, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, and this is the group that was willing to undertake illegal and aggressive actions in the sake of the cause activities, which might well result in women being arrested, and once these women were arrested, they might well go on hunger strike. So these are the women most people think of when they first think of the suffragette movement, but they were only a minority within the whole stream of suffragist consciousness, and as we shall see, also a minority, though a powerful one, within Great Yarmouth. The third group actually split away from the WSPU in 1907, and this was the Women's Freedom League, led by Charlotte Despard. And this was very much stressing actions of a kind of civil disobedience. So they were prepared to break the law, but they were not approving of acts of destruction of any kind. They wouldn't approve of burning down of buildings. For example, their forms of activity included one which is well known, which is the 1911 census. They suggested that women should boycott that census. So this is a Women's Freedom League initiative, which is such a good idea that both the other organisations also take it up. Other forms of civil disobedience would be refusing to pay taxes, refusing to pay income tax if you were a woman of such status as to pay that tax. Refusal to pay dog licenses is another common example. So this is a Women's Freedom League. The Great Yarmouth Women's Suffrage Society is founded on the 10th of May 1909. Its first meeting is held at 4 Wellesley Road, and the key figure in the foundation of it is a lady called Mrs. Ethel Leach. Ethel Leach is a key figure in the Yarmouth suffrage movement. She was a widow at this stage. Her husband was John Leach of the ironmonger's business, which functioned in Great Yarmouth until very recently. She is an example of a woman who was achieving firsts within local government, even in the days before women could stand for Parliament itself. She was on the Yarmouth School Board, for example, and she was also on the Yarmouth Board of Guardians. In 1908, she actually stood for the council. This was only the second year when women were allowed to stand for a borough council, but she failed to get in. So she is the key figure. She's probably the only figure within the Yarmouth group nationally known. She was a friend of Helen Taylor's and was Helen Taylor's election agent when Helen tried to stand as a Member of Parliament for Camberwells in the early 1880s. They gathered together the necessary papers and witnesses, but the returning officer refused to let Helen stand for Parliament at that time. So Ethel was taking part in that activity within London. And this is where it could all be said to have begun. For Wellesley Road, just off Regent Road, in the heart of the tourist part of Great Yarmouth. This house was a boarding house, like so many in that area. This one was owned by a widow, Mary Rogers, also living here with her unmarried sister, Anastasia Brown, and a long-term boarder, Lillian Armitage, who was a teacher by profession and was headmistress of the Pupils Teachers' Centre in Great Yarmouth. So these three women held the inaugural meeting here, attended, of course, by Ethel Leach and other women, and this was the regular basis of all the meetings from the first one onwards, as long as the society existed. And if you look at the members of the society, a surprisingly large number are in fact seaside landladies like Mary Rogers. They form the largest single group within the Great Yarmouth Suffragist Society. And their boarding houses are very close to this area, Regent Road, Marine Parade, several down there, and Wellesley Road itself. So they form quite a large group, the largest group within the society. Apart from the landladies, the other large group within the society is made up of school teachers of various kinds. I've already mentioned Lillian Armitage. Others are working mainly in the local government sector, in the borough council schools, a small number in other private schools or academies or music teachers, so quite a range of activities, but within the teaching world. These women tend to be rather younger than the seaside landladies, and a very large number of them are single women. And there is a reason for that, which is that to be a teacher in the local government system within the borough council schools, if you were a woman, you had to be unmarried, and if you did get married, you were expected to resign, or if you didn't, ultimately you would be dismissed from your job. So this is why there's a high proportion of single women amongst the teachers in the society. And the third largest group of women in the suffrage movement in Great Yarmouth are those connected with the various churches, wives and daughters of vicars and rectors. This is Southdown Church, St Mary's on the Southdown Road. Zooch Turton was the incumbent. His wife and his two teenage daughters were very key members of the suffrage movement, and they, in fact, are amongst those who refused to fill in the census forms in 1911. So when you look at the census returns for the vicarage, 256 Southdown Road, you will find Zooch Turton, as his name was, and his sons, but you will not find his wife or his daughters. Another church which formed a centre for suffrage activity was the Congregational Church in Middlegate. Again, the wife of the clergyman there, George McLuckie his name was, and his wife Mrs McLuckie was another keen member of the Suffrage Society, and I think that she also does not appear on the 1911 census, and other members of that church congregation and officials, the wives of these people, are also show up in the suffrage records for Great Yarmouth. Now, Great Yarmouth had an area of slums which was known as the Rows, which many people lived. Many were poorer people of Great Yarmouth, crowded together, narrow alleys, almost no sunlight, no gardens. But the suffragist ladies did not live here. They were, as I think I've already implied, a kind of women of what would be described broadly as middle class: teachers, landladies, vicars' wives. Of all the 50 or so members of the Yarmouth suffrage movement I've seen references to, I've only come across one who had an address in the Rows in Great Yarmouth, with the obvious implication that the movement here is attracting the middle class rather than the poor. And this is, of course, an impression people do have of the suffrage movement. Not entirely true if you think of the North Country, think of Lancashire, for example, and mill girls joining the suffrage movement along with their union. But you don't seem to get that in Great Yarmouth. You don't seem to get girls, fisher girls, for example, or girls working in grouts joining. It seems to be a rather middle class or even upper class movement. People like Ethel Leach have plenty of money and live in posh houses, either boarding houses, as I've shown you, or detached houses out in Galston, which is where Ethel Leach actually lived. So what did the suffragists actually do in Great Yarmouth? The biggest thing that they did was to hold meetings, public meetings in the town hall. Not very often, once, maybe twice a year. They would hold a grand meeting here. A well-known speaker, somebody national within the movement, would come and would talk to the public here. And the idea, of course, would be that hopefully the women would be inspired by this to join the movement. And you do see this happening. You see in notes in the suffrage minute book of maybe 10 people joining after one of these big meetings here in the town hall. And who were the women that the Yarmouth Suffrage Society was able to invite to be the key speakers in their large meetings held once or twice a year at the town hall? If you read through the executive minutes, you can see tensions between different groups within the society, some wanting to invite suffragettes, people who had taken part in illegal activities, others insisting on inviting members of the NUWSS, the peaceful, law-abiding society. In fact, most times they seem to have compromised by inviting women in from the Women's Freedom League. The 4 biggest meetings were held with women from that league as the keynote speaker, Alice Aberdam twice, and twice Muriel Matters, including their very first big meeting in the town hall. Now, this is Muriel Matters. She's an example of a woman who created an enormous amount of publicity for the cause and who wasn't afraid of breaking the law and going to prison even, but not committing outrages, acts of arson or any kind of violence to property. 2 things she did which gave an enormous amount of publicity for the cause and must have helped make her an attraction when she came to Great Yarmouth Town Hall. One, she and another member of the Women's Freedom League famously padlocked themselves to the grille, to the barrier in the women's area of the House of Commons. So the women's listening area had a grille in front of it, seemed to stop people throwing things into the House of Commons, and these ladies chained themselves to it, and the whole thing had to be removed to get rid of them. And not long after that, she embarked upon another daring stunt. She hired a hot air balloon, and this is a time, don't forget, when there's almost no traffic in the air, so it's just going to be something people are going to stop and stare at, hired a hot air balloon and flew slowly across London with it, dropping leaflets in the cause. So this is Muriel Matters, one of the regular invitees to the Great Yarmouth, taking part in these meetings at the town hall and giving publicity to the cause. The big meetings in the town hall took place once or twice a year. During the rest of the time, the suffragists were engaged in a lower level of activity to publicise the cause. For example, they would disseminate literature. The image shows suffragists in the marketplace in Great Yarmouth, selling newspapers and pamphlets, promoting the cause of women's suffrage. They also held much smaller meetings at homes, they might be called, in people's houses, or slightly larger meetings, not in the town hall, but in hotels, particularly the Criterion and the Savoy, both on Regent Road, where the members would gather, invite friends to come along, hear a local speaker, and hopefully convert them to the cause. If you read through the minutes, as I think I've probably said already, you get a sense of a tension between those who are supporting the peaceful activities of the NUWSS and the more aggressive activities of the WSPU. The leader of the latter group in Great Yarmouth is a lady called Kate Guthrie, not one of the founding members, but she joins in October 1910, and from then on she is continually trying to push the society in the direction of supporting the WSPU, devoting any money that it makes to that cause to help women who've been in prison, inviting WSPU speakers. In the end, in May 1912, she does break away from the society to form her own group, her own WSPU group within Great Yarmouth. So after a few years of existence as one united society promoting the cause of suffrage, the society now splits into two, between those who follow Millicent Fawcett and a peaceful approach and those who follow Emmeline Pankhurst and are prepared to take illegal action in order to promote the cause. When Kate Guthrie forms her own society, naturally her first action is to hold a meeting in the town hall, and here she invites this lady, Georgina Brackenbury. She is one of the out-and-out suffragettes, one of the Emmeline Pankhurst's closest supporters, a woman who has been to prison, who has been on hunger strike, who has suffered for the cause, and she is brought to Yarmouth to inaugurate the WSPU in the town. We don't know how many people left the society. In 1913, the number of members is given as 124. This is before the split. The group then does divide itself into those following the WSPU and the remainder who first remain independent, but of course without the radical element, they are naturally soon drift within the ambit of the NUWSS, and they do become a group which is actually affiliated to that organisation. So there's a split now, two rival groups within the town of Great Yarmouth. The most significant of the peaceful activities was arguably the Great Pilgrimage of 1913, organised by the NUWSS, and in which women from Great Yarmouth took part. This involved women from all over the country marching to London, the whole process being timed so that they would all arrive in London at the same time and hold an enormous rally in Hyde Park. And this represents the culmination of that enormous meeting in Hyde Park, headed by Mrs. Fawcett. And if you can see on your device the big poster behind her, she is stressing that this is a rally of law-abiding suffragists. So she is distancing herself from the kind of activity we've seen with WSPU, involving themselves in at the same period of time. Alongside the peaceful activities of the NUWSS came action from the WSPU within the town of Great Yarmouth. And these would involve acts of destruction. In September 1913, a timber yard in Southtown was set on fire. The following day, the greens of Yarmouth Golf Course were damaged. In both cases, suffragette leaflets left at the scene. In October, there was an attempt to set fire to the wooden scenic railway on the Yarmouth seafront. Fuses were laid, but it was such a windy day, October, in Great Yarmouth, windy night rather, that the fuses were blown out and the structure failed to ignite. However, in April 1914 came a much more spectacular and successful act of arson, which is the burning down of the pavilion on the Great Yarmouth Pier. And as you can see, this was created of a very powerful publicity image. No one was hurt in any of these activities, as was the intention. These are all empty buildings, and the fires take place at night, so there's nobody there, no danger of loss of life, but enormous publicity. And once again, suffragette leaflets are supposed to have been found at the scene of this attack on the Britannia Pier. So there are now two rival groups within Great Yarmouth in 1913 and 1914. And of course, all suffragist and suffragette activity comes to an end in August 1914, when you have the outbreak of the First World War. Some suffragists and suffragettes devote themselves to the cause of promoting the war. Others take a different line and adopt anti-war activities. The society in Great Yarmouth, like many of the NUWSS societies, now raises money not for the suffragette cause, but for a particular cause that it adopts, the Scottish Women's Hospital Organisation. These are ladies who are going out as nurses and founding hospitals on the Western Front and in Eastern Europe and elsewhere where battle is taking place, and doing their best to help heal the soldiers. And the final pages of the Yarmouth Suffragist Society show that they are still raising money, but they are now doing so not for the suffragist cause as such, but for the cause of the suffragist of the Scottish Hospital Group. And these last entries occur in the years 1915 to 1916. And of course, it's only a couple of years after that that the women do indeed get to vote. So we can think of people like Kate Guthrie and Ethel Leach actually voting in the general election of 1918. And the final culmination of all their efforts is 10 years later in 1928, when for the first time the vote is given to women on exactly the same terms as it is given to men. Kate Guthrie had died by then. She died in 1924, but Ethel Leach was among those Yarmouth suffragists who lived to see the cause for which they had struggled finally come to a successful fruition. This is 1928, by which time Ethel Leach is indeed already on the borough council, serving a vital role of power and influence within the town of Great Yarmouth. So this represents the success of the campaign for which they have been struggling in the years before the First World War. Thank you for listening.